Analyst Fitch Solutions global head of country risk has named the rising adoption of cryptocurrencies, the de-dollarization efforts by the BRICS countries, and China's rising economic might as key factors that erode the US dollar's dominance over time. Fitch Solutions global head of country risk, Cedric Kehab, explained why the US dollar's dominance is declining in an interview with CNBC on Sunday. Fitch Solutions provides financial information services. It is a
Chief Steve Forbes. Okay, first to you, Steve. The president not commenting. He's now on a tour of 20 states talking jobs. More and more polls show the Biden White House is failing with voters. Voters don't like what he's doing. The majorities don't like it. They're majority worried about inflation. The majority say he's dishonest. Steve, are they ready for this? China is now trying to replace the U.S. dollar with their currency in global trade. What do you think of that story, Steve?
Well, China, for several years, has made very clear, along with the Russians, they want to downgrade the dollar because they think that'll enhance their power around the world. And certainly the way we've treated the dollar over the year has gone in that direction. However, people are not going to trust the Chinese yuan. You may get these one-off deals like they're doing with the French, but China does not have real capital markets. China has capital controls. And so in terms of currency, people are going to prefer the dollar to the yuan. And so in that sense, I think we've got some time to get our house in order. And that 20-state tour you're talking about with Joe Biden, that shows how utterly out of touch he and his team are in terms of the economy, proclaiming that even though people are feeling that things are not going well, they say things are just fine, shows how utterly out of touch they are with reality. Talk about the ultimate bubble. That tour is it. Yeah,
to what Steve just said, Jason, just factually, talking to economists on Wall Street and in Washington, when they keep saying that they don't want to be named in the quote, but they keep saying this might be one of the worst presidencies we've seen in the modern era. This is one of the worst White Houses they've ever had to deal with. They collapsed the border, record inflation, 14% all in under this White House, and just, more problems for the American people than they expected, Jason.
Yeah, the problem, though, is they think they're doing a great job. And after the 2022 election, Joe Biden said he was not going to change his trajectory in what he's doing. But I think the world, and certainly the United States, sees this projection of weakness. And that's why China's on the move. That's why Russia does not feel any pain for the United States. They just took a Wall Street Journal reporter. You got Iran that's developing a nuclear weapon. You have Saudi Arabia forming deals with Iran. I mean, there is nothing that the president can point to that is actually going well. The border's going the wrong direction. Prices are up, and he's such a poor communicator. I mean, that's the thing. He may go on a tour. The answer to our problems is not more cowbell and more Joe Biden. That exacerbates the problem.
Yeah, to what Jason just said, Steve, the U.S. can borrow more cheaply, and we've talked about this, at lower rates than it would otherwise because of the strength of the almighty dollar. It is the world's reserve currency, but we're seeing China doing deals in yuan with the Middle East, with Africa, with France's Total Energies. That's a big liquid natural gas deal. Since the Obama White House, we've added $20 trillion to the U.S. debt. It used to be $10 trillion. The president just wanted to add another nearly $7 trillion. They can only do that because of the strength of the dollar. But, Steve, they're undercutting U.S. defense and they're undercutting U.S. energy. That is what supports the strength of the U.S. dollar.
Yes, the dollar reflects the strength of the American economy, and they're doing everything they can to undermine that economy, doing the exact opposite of what happened in the 1980s under Ronald Reagan. We had a terrible decade in the 70s. Defense was run down. The Soviet Union, amazingly, was seen as the rising power. And then Reagan came in and turned things around. People put Reagan in because they realized the U.S. was in deep trouble. People today recognizing more and more we're in deep trouble. They're very, very anxious about what's happening around the world. The seizure of that journalist is one example, but also China's now trying to secure the South China Sea, which is an international waterway. And so everything this country is doing is just feeding what our adversaries think is a declining power. And yes, we did respond to Ukraine, but we're not supplying enough weaponry so they can throw out the Russian invaders. So Putin is getting a second chance there. And the Chinese look at that and say the U.S. does not have the staying power that it had after World War II. And that's a very dangerous situation because I think ultimately after 2024, when we get a new regime, and we will, the United States is going to be coming back. And that's where miscalculations can come. They don't realize how this country can rebound as we've done before, and I think we're going to do it again.
Jason, to what Steve just said, the polls show it. Voters do not like this presidency. They keep saying America deserves better. What this far-left power structure in Washington has done is basically destroyed and undercut the U.S. right now on the world stage. Where do we go from here, Jason? This is a failed presidency.
Well, I think the country needs to come to grips that the progressive wing of the Democratic Party is taking over. This is no longer your parents' Democratic Party. I don't think there's a room for an actual true liberal or Democrat in this.
President Xi Jinping, he criticized sanctions for stoking those pains in a speech kicking off this year's BRICS summit. Take a listen.
Politicizing, instrumentalizing, and weaponizing the world economy using a dominant position in the global financial system to wantonly impose sanctions would only hurt others as well as hurting oneself, leaving people around the world suffering.
President Xi also looking to bolster relations with emerging markets amid strained Western ties. For more, let's bring in Bloomberg's Greater China Senior Executive Editor John Liu. John, this is a really interesting grouping, right? I mean, we call them BRICS because they're emerging economies, but at the same time, geopolitically speaking, and how they're aligned, especially with India being a close ally to the U.S. What sort of message was President Xi trying to send?
I think China sees geopolitics, no matter where it is around the world, in the lens of Beijing vis-a-vis Washington. And I think with the invasion of Ukraine, Xi Jinping is using this opportunity to speak to this audience in the emerging markets, which maybe didn't have that much skin in the game when it came to the Ukraine, but is now feeling the repercussions of not only the sanctions, but of higher commodity prices, higher food prices as a result of that invasion, and trying to speak to that audience and trying to gather some support for China's position, which is sort of diplomatically supporting Russia, but also trying to put much of the blame for the conflict on the U.S. when it comes to NATO and its expansion in Eastern Europe.
John, we know that there are expectations for a Xi Biden call sometime perhaps this summer. Are the tariffs on China likely to be reviewed at this point?
I mean, all the noise that we're hearing out of Washington at the moment is that, yes, they will be reviewed, and very likely some portion of those tariffs will be removed in a way that will help the U.S. in terms of inflation, but then leave President Biden some room politically, domestically, as we come to the midterm. That should be a point of discussion when the two leaders meet. Obviously, China would like to see those tariffs lowered, especially with the economy as weak as it is right now.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about the economy, because it seems China wants to continue to ease up on regulations, especially around the fintech sector as well. What do we know?
So Xi Jinping, in addition to the BRICS summit yesterday, also spoke at a meeting of the Commission to Deepen Reform. And there he talked about supporting the platform economies, which is sort of a way of talking about big tech. And obviously, companies like Alibaba, companies like Tencent have really suffered from this crackdown in terms of anti-competitive behavior and other regulatory things. But they are really large, important employers. And as the economy slows, as jobs become scarcer, China needs those companies to step